Migizi Sullivan Sr. from the Courte Ojibwe Nation is a linguist, storyteller, and ceremonial leader devoted to the revitalization of Ojibwe language and a father of 4 fluent speakers. He reminds us that language is more than words. It's ceremony, humor, and connection. In this episode, Migizi inspires us to speak our languages shamelessly, unapologetically, and fearlessly. At the heart of the conversation is our asemaa, the spiritual currency of Ojibwe people, and the sacred responsibility language carries. Through laughter and story, he calls on us to re-normalize our languages in daily, fun, and communal ways. Bonjour. Welcome to Tending Our Roots with Indigenous Methodologies, where we explore Indigenous approaches to research, evaluation, and community practice.
Our conversations center how Indigenous knowledges and ways of being address the structural limits of Western frameworks. This podcast is a living resource for those nurturing the health, healing, and futures of Indigenous communities.
I'm Migas Gonzalez.
And I'm Jill Fish.
Bonjour, Migizi. So in prior conversations, we talked all about language use, language revitalization, language context, and language landscapes. One of the things that you said that stayed with us was something to the effect of, nothing matters without language. When we don't speak our language, what's at stake? And when we do, what do we stand to gain?
Aho, miigwech, gagwej mi egg, de be gagigadoyan, de be gakin, de mukazoyan, bungi. So, miigwech, for the question, I think when we originally spoke on the matter, I was speaking in reference to who you might consider the founder of mainland North American Indigenous language revitalization or immersion methodology, and that's the late, great Daryl Kipp. And so around 1999-2000, Daryl Kipp provided what would become the encouragement, guidance, insights, and lessons learned for Native language activists developing their own tribal language programs. And in that session, Daryl provided some remarks to some key individuals that were in the room that were sent there by the Grotto Foundation to learn from Daryl. He was the founder of the Pagan Institute in Browning, Montana. So anyway, his document starts off, and I don't want to misquote him, so I'm going to read directly from the document itself. He says, "Keep in mind that language is the key. There is nothing else. There is no other priority. There are no other issues. There is no reason to defend your motives, your actions, or your vision. You do not defend yourself, your own language fluency, or lack of fluency. You do it. Action is the key. Native children who are actively speaking the language are your only result." And so that would become the sort of manifesto that inspired a whole generational shift in North American Indigenous language teaching and learning, and the whole context shifted from word lists and flashcards and animals and colors to actual communicative language on a daily basis. And that set the trend in our community. There were some key individuals from the Ojibwe region who were in the room, folks from LCO, Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, and the Twin Cities area. So, of course, I was just a young buck at the time, really early in my language stuff, so that was totally off my radar at the time, but I'm one of the ones who got to benefit from that shift in the movement. And so what you have now is a whole spectrum of language activists, language warriors, some very, very radical who will tell you that nothing else matters and you don't have anything if you don't have language. And depending on where we're at with that, community-wise, individual-wise, where we fall with regard to that, what kind of determines, the language isn't everything for everybody, but depending on who you are, where you come from, and the status or the progression of language reclamation in your community might resonate, language is everything. So we have a whole generation coming up of shamelessly unapologetic language warriors, and I do my best to prepare some of the others. We struggle with our fragilities, our indigenous fragilities due to our collective experience through colonization. And so we're not all at the same stage of the process of decolonizing ourselves. And we have to remember that as educators and researchers, so everybody feels like they're a part of it and positive about it. Yeah.
I love that, because there has been recognition in my own community too that there's generational differences in how people relate to language, and how there's up and coming generations of what you say, of Indigenous people who are shameless and unapologetic about speaking the language. And I think that is so lovely to think about, that healing that occurs through this process. And it kind of goes to our next question, which talks about how the removal of language from our communities has been so deeply traumatic, from boarding schools to this generational shame that you just alluded to, and lateral violence. So how do we create language learning spaces that are healing and not re-traumatizing in our communities?
Yeah, that's really is the key for all of us involved with bringing it back and making it accessible in our communities to adults. I think that's where the real balancing act and delicate dance comes with our adults in our community, because the adults in our community have a special relationship to the language. The language is sacred to them. The language is very, very special to them. And because of that, they don't want to mess it up. Because of that, they have a complex about speaking it, and a block. I think there's research going on in Canada right now about that block that we have as Indigenous people with returning to our language. So as a language educator, we have to make the space safe. And one way we do that in our institution is we use our asemaa, we use our spiritual gift of tobacco on day one, and we pass tobacco to our students, and we speak for that tobacco, and we explain to the students from the get-go that our classroom is the sandbox. Our classroom is the safe space where they can try it out, where they can say it wrong. And I encourage them to say it wrong 100 times. I tell them you got to say it wrong 100 times before you ever say it right. And you get the freedom to do that here. And we have a lot of fun. We try to make the class so it is no pressure, low pressure and low stakes. And we treat the unpacking of all that baggage as a spiritual sort of journey, and we rely on the spiritual tools, the support that we've been uniquely given as Anishinaabe people. So a lot of times reconnecting to our language is the first step. That's the key to reconnecting to everything else that we've been cheated out of as a people due to this process of colonization. So that's in all of our DNA, and that's in every single one of us as Indigenous people. We carry the weight of that history. And when we have that healthy avenue to reconnect and reclaim what was rightfully, wrongfully taken from us, that's part of the recipe for the healing. And when you connect to the language, I can't speak for every Indigenous language, but I do have a assumption that it's pretty similar. When you speak of your tribal heritage language, it unlocks a part of your thinking and your personality even, and your world becomes a more fun place, and more they say everything's funnier than in Ojibwe, right? Or whatever, language X, whatever your tribal language is. And I think there's some real truth to that, because there's a level of creativity and what you might describe as exaggeration that happens in our Indigenous language that paints really, really vivid, hysterical images in the minds of the listeners. So, and then all the taboo that you have with regarding social use of language that happens in colonial languages about, can't say this or can't say that. It's sort of no holds barred when you speak your Indigenous language, because who's going to let the colonial mainstream decide what the norms are or the regs are for our Indigenous languages? We get to decide that.
I love that. I love that it's almost healing in and of itself, because it's a language that's, like you said, that sandbox made me think of like playfulness and that freedom you talked about. which also leads to our next question, as you shared that immersion is merely a method for learning, but for so many, the word immersion can be triggering. What should we consider when designing language programs? How can we reframe our thinking around language acquisition to accelerate language revitalization?
Yeah, good. And I think that's spot on the point. If we were to offer a class and we were to call it immersion class, there's people that aren't going to sign up just because of that word. Immersion is, freaks them out. It makes them think that, I'm not good enough. I can't survive in there. I'm not going to understand anything that they're saying. And it is a method. And I think in most tribal communities, we associate the word immersion with a type of school. So people think immersion is like really super intense. But if you were to go to any high school right now in the area or any college in the area and you were to sign up for a entry-level Spanish class, that's going to be an immersion class. And they may not call it immersion, but all good language teaching in 2025 happens through the medium of the target language. And that's only been a thing for Indigenous people, especially in our area, since Mr. Daryl Kipp that I mentioned earlier. So it's a very, very new thing for us. We have an immersion school in our community that's about 25 years old. So you think about that, right? The history of the teaching of a language like English or the language of Spanish goes back thousands of years, whereas we've been at it for about 25 years in this particular method. So when we think about, designing language programs, I think my first advice to everybody would be go read Daryl Kipp, because it is really the manifesto that led to the success that you see in the communities that are still thriving with regard to language reclamation. So that's part of it, right? Is having that understanding of being unapologetic and fearless. So I think with our language, with the trauma, with the baggage that we carry, we're timid and we feel we can't do this, or we limit ourselves. We have res kid blinders on, as they say it. So we can't even really see the big picture unless somebody helps us see it or shows us. So that's a big part of it. I think a lot of times communities will jump immediately to the children. So once they realize their language is endangered and there's something that they need to do, then they'll start an immersion school, or they'll start an immersion program, or they'll start an immersion classroom. And less than 5 years into that effort, they'll realize they missed a step. They didn't consider the critical mass that they might need to keep that school going, or keep that class going, or keep that effort going. So what you're seeing now, most recently, is the shift to adult training. So training our adults to repopulate the pool, if you will, the people we have to pick from for these schools, and subs and bus drivers and cooks and all that stuff. We need people that do everything. So I think that's a really critical step that's just now dawning on a lot of our communities. But that's a big part, because you can get your immersion effort going. And Daryl Kipp would have told you to go home and do it right now. Don't wait for anybody. Don't ask permission. Go do it right now. And then reframing our thinking around language acquisition to accelerate language revitalization. I think it has to be centered around practical, communicative language. So when we get into teaching and learning spaces as Indigenous people, we're often real structure heads. So we get in there and we put the words on the board and we pick apart the words and we talk about the words, though we don't use the language to do that typically. And in these schools, in this newer shift of the teaching, it's the language as the vehicle for the teaching. So everything happens that way. Now, of course, you have to have a level of proficiency to get there, and there's some awesome models of training to get there. If you do your teaching in a communicative, practical manner, then you're equipping your students to use the language outside of the classroom in those spontaneous settings that matter. And that's the real trick to language teaching, is making it safe, fun, and effective. And by effective, it has to be used and re-normalized, recontextualized. And when our students walk into our classrooms, they hear Ojibwe. And a lot of the students remark in the first couple of classes, like, holy man, that's the most Ojibwe I've ever heard in my life. And that becomes normal after a few weeks, and that's the expectation after a few weeks. And the comfort level kind of increases after. I think everybody's really on the edge of their seat when we roll out our class. Like, oh my God, these guys don't mess around. But, we describe it as like the weight room, right? Like you come to class and, for all the people listening out there that have an interest to get into your tribal language, classes help, like especially if you have a good instructor that knows what they're doing, that'll help you, but that's not going to be the saving grace. The best thing you're going to get out of class is the tools to continue to be that lifelong language warrior, language learner. And that's how we set it up, so we describe it as the weight room. Like we can show you around, we can show you how to lift weights, we can show you how to work out. But if the only time you work out is when you come here, you're never going to get buff like us, right? You really got to work out in your own time if you want to be buff like us. So that's kind of the environment that our students walk into,
What you're talking about, language being effective, I really liked the use of that word because it's not whether you're right or wrong or a bad or good language speaker. It's, are you effective or are you not? And that kind of takes it out of that shame place of, am I being effective with my use of language? But what you're talking about too, about there has to be this intergenerational learning and use of language. So it can't just be children or kids. It has to be adults and parents and caregivers too. So that when children go home, they're able to use their language and practice it in this relational way, which I think you mentioned when we first met and talked that that's how you would learn language, is going around and sitting and chatting with people around a coffee table. But times are different now. So you're helping shift the conversation around language learning by emphasizing daily language use. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and why everyday language use is such a powerful focus for revitalization?
Yes, I'm so glad that you asked, because that's one thing we're shifting to in terms of how we talk about this stuff at home, back home in Ojibwe country, but also in our work on the national level. And since we started to realize our languages were in trouble, we've always been following the sort of colonial interpretation of that and the stages of language loss, and it's all quantified by L1s, or what we call first language speakers, native language speakers. And when it comes to North American Indigenous language, we're not gaining in those numbers. And so why do we keep counting, right? We're not getting good news delivered to any of our communities. And instead, what we should be talking about and what we are talking about in this context is daily language users, DLUs. And when you think about language revitalization, your number of L1s aren't going up in the current context, and they never are going to go up. We're never going to have the same context that we had. And so the context is a new one, and we need to find a new way to quantify that. And instead of using the colonial models or the colonial interpretation of that, how about we decide how many people use our language in our community on a daily basis and have that be our metric? Because if that starts to go up, then we're winning, right? Then we're turning a corner. If that doesn't go up, then we're in trouble. And what you'll find in a lot of communities that still are lucky enough to have elders is there isn't much language user development happening around them, which is a really, really sad and unfortunate reality, that in Indigenous communities, we often don't even realize our languages are as endangered as they are until we start to lose the people that we rely on for those language-related needs. And in a lot of our Ojibwe communities, that's in the form of our ceremonial leadership or Anishinaabe naming ceremony kind of thing. And when we start to run out of people that can do those ceremonies, then it's a uh-oh moment, and now we have to get busy. And so a lot of times we take that for granted. We take that for granted when we have that. And then when we don't have that anymore, something wakes up in us and really inspires our own motivation to just sort of catapult. And I think you meet anybody from Ojibwe country who has acquired our language as a second language will tell you that exactly. Exactly, that's what happened to them. Yeah.
something that I was thinking as you were talking is the focus is on daily language use. So trying to inspire and motivate people to use the Ojibwe language or their Indigenous language on a regular daily basis. What do you say to people who might think they need a PhD or some type of level of higher education to be able to do this kind of work? Because I think, I know you have your PhD. I have a cousin in my home community who also had his PhD, who was in charge of our language revitalization. And then there's the elders, who are pointed to as those first language speakers. What about those people who are just everyday community members who are not getting a PhD, who are not an elder? How do they come to this daily language use?
I think they're the best ones. I think those of us that have the accolades and the advanced degrees, we often get in the way more than we help. When it comes to tribal language work, I think it's a definite benefit for every tribe, every tribal community to have a homegrown language beast. Somebody who knows the ins and outs of the structure and the history of the language and the sort of dialectology and all of that. That's really, really vital for tribal communities to have their own, do that, not rely on the mainstream sort of touch and go researchers that have been in their communities. So I encourage all young Anishinaabe people to seek out those avenues in education so they can be their own community's beast. That's the sort of message we were all preached to as kids, is go out, get that training, that education, come back and help your people. Now, there's so many examples across North America of real homegrown language warriors that don't have advanced degrees, that do incredible language work. And most of them have had the opportunity to be around really special elders or be around really special people who took the time, saw something in them, and helped build them up. So some of the best ones, I would say, don't have advanced degrees, and they have a PhD in the real life language trenches, and that's a more grueling grind than the halls of academia, for sure.
I love that. I love that so much, because it can be so intimidating for people to show up in this way to learn the language and to even, I think, hear that message from you that that's what we actually need, I think is a really powerful message.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's, the top-down efforts of language work often fall short. And what I mean by that is sometimes you'll have government agencies or tribal level administration that throw money at different programs, throw money at different people. And if it isn't the real grassroots, bottom-up effort, it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall, they say in teacher education. So when the young people realize, hey, man, we didn't have this, or we want that. See what they're doing over there? We want that. When the young people realize it and start to go for it, and especially as they become parents, because parents really change the landscape and the mindset of education and educators. And I think that's what happened at home. We had young people that took a stand to acquire the language and show it off, and started to raise their kids, and that inspired people around them to do the same thing and raise their kids with Ojibwe and send their kids to our immersion school. And now, we have families in the community that have everyday home language, and that's, first time in 70 plus years probably in our community where we can say that. And again, if you were to go around and quantify first language speakers, it would look like we didn't have any good news going on in our community. Mm-hmm. So we're shifting to the DLU.
The flip side of that question for me is often, maybe I'll talk in a personal sense of seeing some folks that really have the language, and it's almost like there's something spark in them that just and it's not the education piece, right? But it's something that drove them, that guided them, and that moved them towards this fluency, right? And I also hear folks talking about language in a way that's almost like a field, like it's separated from things, right? Like language is something you could focus on, or there's other things to focus on. the thing that I want possibly to touch on are the folks who just want the simplicity of having language in their daily lives. Not maybe they're not seeking to be language warriors or something in that sense, but still wanting to have that because it's something spiritually important.
Yeah, very good. I think so. 2 parts. The whole compartmentalization of our language that happens at the professional level, education level, all that. Yeah, that's it's kind of toxic, and we got to get away from that. I think so many, back to the spectrum of decolonization and the different various points we're on that spectrum. Some of our people just think that way, right? They think, oh, we have language. Look at us. We have language. So we have a language program. We do classes where we have language. Check the box kind of thing. And then there's other people who really try to build their institution or their community around that, the fact that they have language or a thriving language effort. So I think, it's a leadership level thing. Like the one thing that plagues language communities and stalls language communities is often poor leadership. And I think that could be said about anything tribal in our modern era. But we're working on it, and that these young leaders are coming up. But back to the whole, whether you just want to be a language user and have language in your daily life, no matter what profession or field you're in, I think we're getting better with that. I think we're having more language people out and about that have functional levels of proficiency where they can use the language. I think what happens, though, is as people progress with their language ability, they get pushed into these different arenas of teaching or spiritual leadership, and that's where they really grow. So you may want to just be a nurse or a bus driver, but Ojibwe starts getting good, and you start getting pulled into the classroom, or you start getting pulled into doing the ceremonial talks, or you start getting pulled into some domain where your language really grows, and a new passion or comes up for you, where maybe you didn't even realize you wanted to be a teacher, or you didn't realize you'd be a good storyteller or a good ceremonial officiant until you do it. But I think everybody we can think of that has acquired our language as a second language, they have that story, right? Somebody put tobacco in their hand and threw them in the deep end of the pool way before they were ready for it, And that's kind of how we have to think about the new design and rollout of the landscape for the young ones coming up, and how do we throw them in the deep end in a new ever-changing context.
So language learning can feel intimidating, as we've talked about already, or out of reach for many people. How are you working to make it more accessible, and what advice would you offer to those just beginning their journey with language?
Good. I previously taught in our immersion school on the reservation, and it was really, really awesome job. My language just grew. My own language ability grew so much by being with those kids, and I learned so much about teaching language work by being with the kids and being with the elders kind of simultaneously. And but what I realized in doing that work is my reach wasn't hitting very many people. I'd have maybe 7 kids in the classroom one year, maybe 9 the next year. I felt that I had so much in my big old egghead that I wanted to get out to my relatives in the greater community, and that was the main reason for my shifting over to our university, our own tribal university that we have, so I could increase the access to the language. And so all of our classes that we teach there are Zoomable. We Zoom out to everybody, and we have people all over the Ojibwe territory and beyond that take our classes. So we have graduate students from different universities that don't have the option to take language classes, advanced language classes in their institutions. We get to, working professionals, lawyers, doctors, nurses who Zoom in for classes because there's an opportunity for it. Whereas in the previous generation, there was a real fear of technology. There's a real fear of documentation and all of that coincides with levels of endangerment. So your level of insecurity with your tribal language coincides with the level of endangerment. So if your language isn't very endangered, then people aren't really worried about it or insecure about it. They'll put it all over Facebook. But in certain communities where it is endangered, people don't like that. And we went through that for a while. I remember when the ITV and all those technology breakthroughs were coming out in the 90s and early 2000s. People in our community didn't like it at all. They didn't want the language broadcast out. And then we got to this make or break sort of moment. And if we have students out there that can't be in person, and our own Anishinaabe students and us as an Anishinaabe institution on our Anishinaabe homelands with Anishinaabe instructors and students, if we don't have the authority to do that, who does? So I think that's another important word of advice for communities is we really have to take ownership of our language as a movement and not let ourselves be crippled by stats or the Western way of thinking about it. Right? We have to be the ones to tell people what the status of our language and where we're at with it, and not let anybody else determine that. So the accessibility piece, right, and the reach of that. I think there's been a real movement as of late to share, right? And with the MEIN organization, the Midwest Indigenous Immersion Network, of creating shared resources among our schools and camps and programs, like that's new. That's new to Ojibwe country. We were all reinventing the wheel in each school, in each classroom, in each program, and now having that network. So I think going into the field is becoming a little easier. We're making those different avenues for accessibility for people teaching, and even people outside of teaching can really rely on the resources from their really precious stuff. For people just beginning their language journey, I remind them when I was a real beginner. I knew a lot of words. I grew up, we had language classes as kids, and it was all the same stuff every year, simple nouns and a few verbs here and there, but it was real basic level stuff all through school. But I paid attention to that stuff, and I listened, and so I'd say I went into my adult years a little more equipped than my peers, and I had a real interest in it. And by doing that, I started to ask elders how to say stuff and fill up these little notebooks with all my weird questions. And by that time, I kind of had a reputation in the community of being a language learner, and started to get asked to talk for different feasts or celebrations and stuff. And I was nowhere near ready for any of that. But anyway, I had a special old man, Bijikibun, his name was Harold Frog, and I could go visit him any time of day, and I could ask him anything in the world. And he usually had an answer for me. And he was real excited about my interest and about my growth. And I got a little better by going to see him and visit with him. But one day I was really frustrated. I couldn't understand what he was trying to tell me, how he was explaining it or whatever. And I was banging my head against the wall, as we tend to do. And he tells me, he says, "You know what, Mike? You know what you got to do? You got to take your asemaa out to the tree." He said, "And you got to ask for it. You got to ask that money to do it and have them make it easy for you. And if you do that, it'll probably come easy to you." And when he first told me that, I was thinking, like, man, what kind of advice is that? That's not going to work, young guy. But I did it. I went outside and I started to put my tobacco down every day, just make it easy for me. And lo and behold, things started to happen in my life. It was like beyond coincidence. It was like, oh my God, like everything started to fall into place and things started to click, and my access to great speakers that, I didn't even know were around, how those doors started to open up, and we got a belief in that as a people. And I think that's the most important part about all of this is the language and our tobacco and our form of spirituality, that's unique to us. And there's so much power in that. And our communities have been removed from that, so far removed from that, if it's an old man telling me like that, it was almost like a unbelievable thing he told me, like what? And then how effective it was, beyond coincidence. And so for communities that have really been destructed by colonization and Christianity and all these other forces that have just tore us apart, language and culture-wise. There's a lot of damage repair, damage control to do, and all of it's only surface level if we don't address the spiritual level, and we don't reconnect to our way of life we were uniquely given as a people. Otherwise it all seems it must all seem kind of phony in the eyes of our Creator if we're not there. And when you think about those people from your community that have acquired our language in this day and age, then you know their involvement in that. And that's a lot of pressure, for our generation. We had that preaching as young people through our ceremonial way of life. Like, if we don't have people that can conduct these ceremonies, and we lose that connection, we lose that ability to communicate in our unique way as Anishinaabe people. And that goes to our namings, that we have for our babies, all the way to the funerals, when we send our relatives home and everything that happens in between. Like, if we don't have a way to do that, that's really scary, and we were preached that as kids, and so, like, when you grow up and you don't really think about that, and then as you start to see your elders pass away and your relatives, and we have to organize and make sure that they get sent to where they need to go, that pressure builds every year, every generation. And this has been a real tough season for us in Ojibwe country. We lost some of our giants, man, in just a short few months, and they did their best to show us what we got to do, and they hung in there with us as long as they could. And now the pressure's on. Hate to think about pressure back when they were all here and we had to talk in front of them. It's like, man, now they're checking out on us, and we got to talk without them. And but we're going to do it, and we're going to keep on. And otherwise, all that time they spent with us was wasted. So we're not going to waste their time, and we're not going to waste ours. And but the training of the next ones, that's going to look different, and we gotta be ready for that, and we gotta expedite that, because these young ones coming up, they want to know everything yesterday, and we got to do our best to get it to them.
So language is not just simply something to be achieved or attained. It's a way of life, and it's a worldview and a way of being.
Yeah, very much so, and a much more beautiful and fun worldview. I think about colonization. I tell my students that, my English-speaking American students in my native studies classes, like, imagine somebody coming in and colonizing the U.S. right now, and everything you knew about your culture, you now had to talk about it in a totally different way, totally different language. So talk about your MTV of the 90s, or your McDonald's and your Abercrombie and Fitch, or your everything that's American is apple pie, and you can't do it in the only way you know how. And then you'll have a little understanding of where we're at in North America as Indigenous people, right? And reintroducing our people back to that, and making that fun and exciting, and not such a downer, because we've had enough of the downer experience. And part of the healing is coming out of that, right? So we just don't sit around and talk about the trauma anymore, because especially the younger generation, my kids and that whole generation, like, this isn't weird for them. This isn't endangered to them. They've known Ojibwe their whole lives. They've known people that speak Ojibwe their whole lives. So when they jump into conversations where all we do is talk about trauma in boarding school, they're like, what? It's a different day and age, and we got to get with the times, kind of, so to speak. So, I'm excited to be involved in that and be one of the, I'm not a very old fella at all, but I'm older than these kids coming up, and maybe they see me as older. But I'm happy to be involved with that, and I'm glad that I have the outlook on it, because we still have people in our circles that are going around talking about our language is dying, and I'm sitting over here like, wait, man, we turned the corner in a lot of places, let's talk about that. I don't try to send sappy message that we get in a lot of these conversations. There's so much hope and so much to be proud of. Everything we've been through and cheated and robbed of as a people, it's a bigger miracle. Everything we've managed to maintain in spite of all of that trauma and that horrific experience. We stand on the winning side of it all.
Very inspiring.
I think that's such a great message to end on. This has been so eye-opening for me, someone who would be a second language learner. And I imagine there's many people out there listening who are going to be inspired by this as well. So Migizi Nyawa Miigwech for coming here and visiting with us today. We really appreciate it.
Miigwech bizinda mig.
You have been listening to Tending Our Roots with Indigenous Methodologies. We are your hosts, Jill Fish, Tuscarora Nation.
And Migas Gonzalez, Lakudere Ojibwe. This podcast was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and supported by the Circle P50 Center of Excellence, funded through the National Institute on Drug Abuse of the National Institutes of Health. The content is solely the responsibility of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the official views of their funders.
Production of this season was made possible by solar-powered studios in what is now known as St. Paul, Minnesota, on Dakota homelands. Podcast artwork was completed by Marlena Miles, a Spirit Lake, Dakota, Mohegan, and Muskogee artist. Our theme song, Best of Me, is used with the permission of Anishinaabe and First Nations singer-songwriter Leonard Sumner. You can find more detailed information in our show notes.
Miigwech for listening.
Nyawa.
If you'd seen the dark that I've seen and the struggle, you wouldn't walk another mile on your own.